Welcome back. Chapter 8, Health and the Environment, widens our lens about as far as this course is going to take it. We've gone from individuals, families, and communities, and now, in this chapter, to the planetary ecosystem itself. This chapter asks us to treat the environment, which is climate, food systems, and ecosystems, not as a backdrop to health, but as a direct determinant of it, actually even a co-participant, on par with the social determinants of health we've discussed in earlier chapters. So this chapter will necessarily be very interdisciplinary in design. Health sciences and nursing students will recognize environmental and climate health as an increasingly central topic in public health practice. Communication students are going to find rich material here in environmental communication, framing, and advocacy campaigns. And everyone in this class will be asked, over in different ways today, to move from analysis into designing actual communication interventions. So there will be many more applied and activity-driven engagements during the chapter. And of course, in your engagement and advocacy section, you're going to jump right into doing a lot more of that application and looking at how social justice or the justice principles play out in action. Let's take a look at today's 6 objectives. In this lecture, you're going to understand knowledge about the environment and its components as a human health issue that informs WPHC and SJA, or whole person health communication and social justice activism. We're going to explore climate change, food and culture, human migration, the emergence of novel pathogens and infectious diseases. These are all direct corresponding elements of health as they intersect with the environment. We're going to examine human health and food structures, going from nutrition stability, nutrition security, food stability, sustainability, to social capital. We're going to apply environmental communication, health communication, and environmental justice within a social justice activism perspective to address these challenges. And we're going to understand the relationship between the planetary ecosystem, ecosystem health, and both individual and public health. In doing all this, our goal is that you will be able to design social justice and activism interventions at the individual, local, community-based, and organizational level. Now, this last objective is actually, as with the course, the connecting thread in everything that we do. Every section of this chapter is going to ask you to sketch out what a communication intervention addressing that specific issue might actually look like in practice. So we are really going from concept to practice from multiple angles as we are doing in the course. So let's take a look at this from the point of view of the environment as a human health issue. Let's start with that. So we're going to start by looking at the foundational definitions, which means what do we actually mean by the environment? Climate, weather, things that we always use every day, but we need to be more precise about what they mean. By being precise, we can clearly tease out their implications on health. So let's look at what the relationship between environment and human health might involve. So broadly, the term environment refers to habitats, the composition of those habitats and their resources, and their relationships with one another. The environment can be understood as all of these elements together, the space within which human activity occurs. So give that a thought. As you give that a thought, you're going to notice how broad this definition for environment is. It includes everything from a marine ecosystem to, as we'll see, the mountains in the next slide, and to an urban neighborhood in which you may live in. When we say environment in this chapter, we mean the full set of physical, which is built, and natural and ecological conditions surrounding human life. not just nature in the narrow sense. Now, the links for these, like for the biology's definition of an environment, and particularly marine environment, are given in a link that is appended at the end of this lecture slide on my classes, the Canvas site on which this lecture is uploaded. So as we go along, please take a moment to pause this lecture and delve into that link. So if you look at this link, you'll see a definition of an environment and a marine environment and what that encompasses. Climate. So that was the environment, but we use sometimes environment and climate interchangeably. But like I said, in this class, we need to be a little more precise if we have to tease out their implications with health. Climate is the average weather in a place over a period of time over many years. So for example, I might say where I live, the climate is actually an average. So over summer, this is an average range in which the temperatures fall, let's say over the last 50 years or 3 decades or what have you. So it is actually referencing the long-term weather pattern in a particular area. The term climate references elements of the weather, such as the average precipitation, temperature, humidity, sunshine, and wind over a long period of time over a particular place. Now, we've done this kind of, you probably I check WeatherBug. You might be checking another app, and it probably gives you all these indicators in there to give you an idea of what your climate is. So keep this long-term average definition in mind, because that's what distinguishes climate from what we look at in the next slide, which is weather. We'll think about weather in terms of how we can distinguish it from climate. Weather references changes over a short period of time, a few hours or from hour to hour, day to day, month to month, or year to year. Weather will include things like cloud cover, rain, shine, temperature, humidity, precipitation, cloudiness, visibility, wind, and atmospheric pressure. This is all from NASA. So climate was the average over long term, but weather is your day-to-day. What's the weather like today? You might ask Siri. My husband often does. With both terms defined, we can now name the 5 components of climate change this chapter asks us to track together, which is climate change and its whole person health communication impacts, mitigating steps for climate change impacts, climate change and human health disparities, and the environment health impacts of climate change. Now you might notice that disparities appear explicitly in this list. Climate change is not experienced equally. Just because we all experience the same climate, we may not experience the effects of climate change or the climate on our health in the same manner. While we take this for granted, in this course, we are going to examine the relationship of environment with health through the lens of social justice, so we are going to pay attention to this fact, or facet, to be more precise. So, we are going to track these things together. Climate change and its whole person health communication impacts, mitigating steps for climate change impacts, climate change, human health disparities, and environmental health impacts of climate change. Some populations bear disproportionate health burdens from the same climate shifts, which is exactly why this belongs in a social justice-oriented health course rather than only in an environmental science or environmental studies course. Let's mull these things through a little bit more. Look deeper into climate change and its components, but now let's do so through a communication lens. How do we talk about climate change and whole person health communication impacts, its mitigation steps, the health disparities, and environmental health impacts in ways that reach the public accurately, fairly, but also that help people make meaning of these terms and their impacts on their health in ways that make sense to their lives? So this is a good moment to look at a real-world example of environmental communication and, if not done thoughtfully, its potential pitfalls. Right here on the right-hand side is a link which gives you FTC's guidance on environmental marketing claims. And these are not often accurately made. So this link is also given under this lecture slide on Canvas. So take a moment if you want to pause this lecture and peruse through that link. As you review it, think about why regulatory guidance around environmental marketing claims exists in the first place. Why do we need it? Is it a case of governmental overreach, or is it unnecessary? Now, what happens to public understanding of climate and health issues when any company or any organization or a social media influencer or anyone at all makes vague or misleading green claims? So the question arises, why does the FTC regulate environmental marketing claims specifically? What health communication parallel do you see with misleading health claims more broadly? Let's pause here and work through a structured set of questions the chapter has posed about designing an environmental health communication initiative. Think about maybe picking up a pen and paper and sitting down with your roommate, your friend, your buddy, or just by yourself and think through these things. So here's what I'm asking you to do when you take this pause. What is a key communication challenge concerning the environment with respect to human health in your mind? Whose health is affected by that challenge? Whose health is at risk, but not in a position to do anything about it? How can communication initiatives make a difference? What kind of communication initiative or artifact would you design? For example, these could be a campaign, a toolkit, a social media series. What would you do? And what would its message be? And what would its goal be? And to whom will it be directed? Who are the key stakeholders? And is this framed as advocacy? So how can communication professionals and experts intervene in this conversation about environmental health to create better conditions for everyone in terms of their health outcomes? Let's next look at the relationship between food, climate, and culture. This is going to have a lot of rich and in-depth material for you, which I hope you're going to find very interesting. We're going to start with food insecurity. Food insecurity focuses on the complex relationship between food, culture, environment, and food-related disparities that arise as a result of this relationship. It's directly responsible for undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, and obesity. Notice that food insecurity can produce both too little nutrition, as we often assume, and as we less often understand, it can also contribute to obesity through too much food that is inexpensive and calorie dense and not exactly nutritious. So systemic food-based inequities are highlighted by the disproportionate burden of disease across class-based struggles, ethnic groups, and nations. Food insecurity is never randomly distributed by chance, so to speak. This connects to what the chapter calls dimensions of food as power. Who controls food production, distribution, and pricing shapes who goes hungry and who doesn't. Let's take a look at a real communication initiative addressing food insecurity. So Feeding America is one of these organizations. Can you take a look at this website? Again, the link is under this lecture slide on my classes canvas, just the same page you're in. It should say a link for slide 10. So how does Feeding America frame food insecurity as a communication and advocacy issue, not just a logistics issue? It's kind of interesting, their website, and my communication students are going to like that, especially if you're going to be designing materials towards any specific goal, in this case, the relationship between environment, climate, food, health. Okay, next up is nutrient groups and social cohesion. We need to recognize that food is more than just nutrient groups. And this recognition has led researchers to examine food from several different perspectives. Things like food as relations, food as body and identity, food as power, and food as culture, amongst others. Keeping the community central can help incorporate both traditional and commercial foods in a way that are articulated by community members themselves. So if you recall, in one of the chapters we talked about community empowerment. So this is where food plays a central role in community empowerment. And it's responsive in very fundamental ways to community traditions, because food and heating food is actually a very communal, family-based, social, and deeply traditional culture, which involves rituals and traditions that go back to often that culture's roots. So let's take a pause now again and take a look at this community food initiative, which I find very interesting. It's called Nourish Life, and it has actually a piece, you'll see it on the top link menu bar, that says food as a bridge to cultural understanding. So it looks at food and cooking and takes a look at how it tells us about cultural understanding. So how can food and community bring about better health outcomes? If you give that a thought, that's an easy way of promoting health amongst underserved minority populations, or those that may be at risk and vulnerable. I'm thinking of rural Americans. I'm thinking of elderly, senior Americans. I'm thinking of those that are differently abled, so disability advocates, things like deaf communities, all of those. What kinds of communication-based initiatives could you design that use food as a bridge to community health? So you're going a little broader than saying, are we just providing the nutrients and the components of the nutrients that they need to stay healthy? So food is not just a nutrient delivery mechanism, is the point here. So keeping traditional dietary components central is emphasized in the whole person health communication approach for two main reasons. First, it helps attend to the environmental sustainability component of things. And second, it helps attend to the diversity of local species that comprise diverse dietary systems for that local microsystem. So food helps us communicate who we are, where we come from, and who we want to become. Food is in some ways identity communication, not just sustenance. And therefore, just giving someone food may not completely, from a whole person health communication perspective, mean health to them. If it is missing the kind of nutrients and the values and the way their culture privileges those nutrients and its consumption in relationship with their environmental, local microflora, and ecosystems and the social relations within which it's embedded. So take a look at this resource on food and identity from Journey magazine. It's again linked under these slides, under slide number 12, as you can see. What initiatives do you see here today that stand out to you in this Journey magazine, and why? How would you communicate your own community's identity through its food culture? That would be interesting. What does it say about you, the kind of food you consume? That is culturally, you might say, the foundation of your traditions. Point is that food, climate, and culture, this domain is not just about the food. Food system sustainability involves more than just the dietary composition of food or its relationship with community and culture. It also includes the full logistical facets of the food system. Let's not forget about that, which includes production, transportation, processing, packaging, storage, retail, consumption, loss, and the processing of food waste. Think about all that goes into it. Right from the farm to the table, of course, but in the middle, for most of us, is when we buy things from your sort of like box grocery store, is the transportation, processing, packaging, storage, retail decisions, and then eventually what happens in terms of loss and processing of food waste. So the entire cycle is actually complex and connected in some ways to our own health from a whole person health communication perspective. Each of these logistic stages carries its own environmental footprint too, or from another facet, and its own health equity implications. Think in terms of, for example, the transportation challenges around food access and the kind of prices or the cooling systems or delivery systems that are involved in getting it to maybe rural and underserved areas and people who live there. So let's take another break and widen how we think about this facet by looking at Wilder research. The link is under your slides, under slide number, let me see what it is. Is it 19? 13. It's under slide number 13. So who do transportation challenges around food access affect the most? What advocacy components do you see reflected in this resource? Yeah, take a look. And I just mentioned retail. So here is a little more thought on the retail part as we kind of intersect with it almost on an everyday basis, where food is sold or isn't sold, and how it shapes health outcomes as much as what food exists in the kind of cultural realm that we've been talking about thus far. What would you focus on when it comes to the food retail culture? If I were to ask you, would it be proximity, pricing, product placement, advertising? What would you, if I were to ask you, what would you focus on specifically advocating for in this space? Take a look at this resource, Healthy Eating Research, again linked under slide number 14. And share your thoughts with a friend, maybe, or make a note of your thoughts. Delving deeper now and looking into the food system sustainability piece of it. The whole person health communication framework considers how all of these aspects of the food system are under pressure from non-climate stressors as well as climate ones. So we have things like population and income growth, rising demand for animal-sourced products, and climate change itself, all of which influence the climate, the weather in various ways. So the environmental impacts of human activity mean that we are facing a fundamental shift in our relationship with nature. How so? Food practices are intimately connected with nature. What we grow, how we grow, where we grow it, and traditionally have shaped the diets and dietary cultures of communities across the world. And they also symbolize this close connection between planetary health and human health. What happens to soil, water, and biodiversity is not separate from what happens to human bodies. Now let's look forward for a bit on this. What challenges do you think stand in the way of a sustainable food culture for our anticipated global population by 2050? You have this resource which discusses basically creating a sustainable food culture by 2050, and it comes to us from World Resources Institute. So take a look. It's linked here below under slide number 16, below the class slides. And discuss it with someone or think it through, take a pause on this lecture and just explore that website as a way of connecting some of the concepts we're seeing to how organizations are actually intervening in practice and how they're communicating that message through websites, charts or graphics or infographics, which you're going to be asked to make in different ways. Because like we've seen, if you don't communicate in thoughtful and considerate ways, then that message itself is going to be distorted or not arrive in the way that you'd like it to, and that its impacts are going to not meet the goals of health promotion or the kind of health outcomes you're seeking to achieve. So in terms of a discussion, pick one challenge to a sustainable 2050 food future and describe how you would focus a communication initiative on it. Who would this initiative be directed towards, and who would it ultimately benefit? We talked about food insecurity. So now let's look into what makes for food security. So we have like 4 components to this. The first is food availability, the production of an appropriate quantity of food to feed everyone. The second part of it is food access, access to food of appropriate quality and diversity from market-based contexts, and the ability to make culturally appropriate food choices. Notice the emphasis on culturally appropriate food choices. And whatever you might think is culturally appropriate in your tradition actually sustains you and gives you health in a way that maybe somebody else's dietary culture, if it were forced on you, would not. Food utilization, the way food is available and how it serves to meet the nutritional needs of community members, is also an important part of food security. So we might think in terms of like farmers market, growing it yourself in vegetable gardens, as some traditions in Europe and across the world might do, and other ways. And finally, we have the fourth piece of it, which is food stability. People's ability to access food and use food in a steady, reliable way, such that no one experiences hunger. So that's sort of reliability around the expectation of food being available. Now, it is this piece of it, food stability, that is most impacted by climate disruption. With increasing extreme weather patterns and events that are or may not be associated with climate change, these can disrupt food stability. For example, through increasing food price spikes after a drought or a flood. Geopolitical constraints as well, but food availability is basically food stability. Food stability is actually the most vulnerable component of all. Looking deeper into food security, the whole person health communication approach considers how both climate and non-climate stressors impact all 4 pillars of food security together. So we're not looking at them in isolation. We're looking at food availability, access, utilization, and stability. So we're not just focusing on one pillar and going with it and saying if we solve this problem, we've probably addressed some of the health components of it all. We need to be attentive to all four in a balanced way. Towards this end, take a pause again and explore the World Bank's food security resources. The link is under your class lecture slides for slide number 18. Within the Global Alliance for Food Security, it's got a biggish name, so GAFS resources. Look at the interactive map, country profiles and resource tabs. Again, for my communication students, this is a communication artifact that is communicating a piece of information towards a goal and is doing so very strategically. So you as the reader is able to achieve certain understandings through in a guided way that has been thought through by those who created it. So it's shaping your meaning making on a topic. So it is a strategic piece of communication. Look at the resources, interactive map, country profiles, and resources tabs for the website as well. Now, think about, for everyone in this class, how do the four pillars of food security connect to the World Bank's overall food security strategy? Looking at the GAFS interactive map and dashboard, which dashboard support area that you might see there might an advocacy campaign focus on and why? Look at the dashboard support area tab. Take a minute and then come back to the lecture. As you move through from there, let's look at food, climate, and culture from the point of view of personalized and culturally appropriate nutrition, a point we've been mentioning for a few moments by now. So personalized or culturally appropriate nutrition provides individuals with dietary advice that emphasizes health promotion, of course, alongside recognizing the individual as part of a broader social and cultural context. So looking at that individual as embedded in a social and cultural context is where we see how whole person health looks at health actually being accomplished. So culturally competent nutrition guidelines. These guidelines, envisioned as being culturally competent, keep culture's influence on lifestyle, food choices, and eating patterns at the heart of it. And in doing so, they incorporate diverse food cultures with a focus on overall well-being. Culturally competent nutrition strategies specifically incorporate cultural diversity in nutrition education and dietary intervention approaches. So they look at nutrition education and also look at it in light of cultural diversity and attend closely to ethno-cultural communities, so diverse communities as well. In doing so, nutrition security, which is, now look at this one, this is, if you just notice the shift, I'm no longer talking about food insecurity, I'm saying nutrition insecurity, is a related but distinct concept. And this one highlights the importance of wholesome, healthful foods and drinks, attending not only to the quantity of food available, but also to its cultural alignment and its ability to nourish. Think about your favorite foods right here, your grandma's food or your mom's favorite dish, and how that is more wholesome, healthful, and helps you kind of feel nourished and full and happy and maybe even healthy in so many ways. So that's whole person health for you. Let's take a shift. We did a lot about food thus far. We talked climate, and now we're going on to the field of environmental communication and environmental justice. We had defined environment and we had done so in very broad terms, and we had connected it to whole person health at the onset. So let's start to bring these pieces together. So environmental communication includes things like sustainability science, which is the management of human environment systems to help meet human needs while protecting ecosystem and environmental integrity. It's a tough ask, and that's where all of us are grappling in this class, and that is the space where you are engaging your thoughts and ideas as you work through this chapter and listen through this lecture and work on the engagement and application activities. So we'd like to be able to meet those human needs while protecting ecosystem and environmental integrity. Environmental health communication, in that sense, specifically directs attention to environmental concerns and their health consequences. So it's a little more narrowly focused and focuses on how environmental concerns, thinking about environment very broadly, are related with health consequences for people and for whom. So when we talk about health, environmental justice. So connecting the broader field of environmental communication directly to the health outcomes we've been discussing throughout this course. And let that sink in. And as you do that, take a pause, just pause this lecture right here and look at this link under the lecture that's set under link for slide 21. It's for Environmental Justice Foundation. And browse through that. They do a lot of work in this domain, and you might find it interesting. Public health and health sciences students, from the perspective of these connections we've talked about, communication students as well, from the perspective of how EJF is a website is a communication artifact designed with a very specific health goal, and it does so in ways that are socially just. So as a piece of strategic communication, it's doing a lot of work right there. So for my class here, everyone, what are your thoughts on EJF as a communication initiative? What do you think about it in terms of how it's advocating? So as an advocacy initiative, that's 2 questions. And third, how would you assess EJF's work from a whole person health community communication and social justice action perspective? So take a moment on that and pause this slide and then come back to it. And we'll start looking deeper into collaboration and activity in the environmental space. Environmental collaboration and advocacy. Every time we talk about advocacy, we think in terms of advocating on whose behalf, for what, and towards what ends. So, environmental collaboration and advocacy is concerned with empowering vulnerable community members. Think about how you might think of who's vulnerable. And, that by itself. So, if we say we have a deaf community here, are they necessarily vulnerable? They probably have their own norms, and we do not want to impose a normative lens on them by coin of our own ability or our own facility with listening. So seeing those whom we label as vulnerable or as at risk as actually empowered and with their own assets that are different from ours, so not in a judging kind of way. To address environmental and health concerns directly, how do we empower different members of our community such that these solutions come from them themselves and we are not really speaking on their behalf? What this requires is communication that bridges several distinct steps or gaps between who we think are experts and non-experts, between clients and who they see and their providers, and sort of like seeing this as a mutually upturned relationship as well, community members and decision makers, and communities themselves. This starts to take us a little bit deeper into the realm of equity and justice from the point of view of who's speaking and how much control do they have over what their beliefs, values, and subjectivities and positionalities are. So environmental communication in this realm aims to address equity in the whole person health communication outcomes by envisioning, as CHEC says, a community that is empowered to become advocates for improving communication within health and environmental contexts in which they are embedded. So the community by themselves, community members make their own decisions, they advocate for themselves, and they're able to do so. So our goal through our communication is to create the conditions whereby they're able to advocate for themselves and their own solutions and make their own decisions. So this direction of empowerment in this vision, if you really look at it deeply, the goal here isn't simply to communicate better to a community. Think about that. We are not thinking about efficient, goal-directed communication, but we are thinking about how we can build capacity. So capacity building for a community in terms of how they're able to advocate for themselves in these spaces going forward. This whole space of environment so broadly defined with its relationship with food, climate, production, those 4 pillars, and everything else we've talked about as human activity and communities are embedded within these relationships. We talked about environment, weather, and climate. So things we've been seeing, and they become kind of fraught and contested. The climate change communication space, it's simply one space of environmental communication. How do we understand climate phenomena, and how can those messages guide action in a way that people and the ecosystems in which they're embedded are able to live healthful, sustainable lives, not just in the moment, but also in the future? So think from the communication perspective. Take a moment. This is slide 24. You'll see the link embedded, and you should be able to access this journal from the Communication and Mass Media database on SU Libraries. Take a look at this journal and browse the journal's recent topics. Do you see any articles that explore the relationship between environmental communication and health communication specifically? What stands out to you? This might take you a few moments. So again, grab a cup of coffee or a nice drink or what have you, and pause this lecture and just take a look. And we'll start going a little deeper into environmental justice. From advocacy to justice is a short hop. Environmental justice. When we do the work of environmental justice, we are looking at creating meaningful change through communities that are actively engaged in all stages of research, dissemination, and evaluation process, and not only brought in at the end to receive the results. So any community, whether it's a rural community of farmers, agriculturists, or of any other type, think in terms of your own communities or the communities that you're a part of or are aware of. When we think about environmental justice, we're thinking about creating meaningful change in their health outcomes in a way that is meaningful to those community members from their perspectives, their traditions, their relationship with nature and environment and their lived spaces, and in ways that speak meaningfully towards honoring all of that. We are not here to really say here are nutrition specific guidelines and that's the end of our story, but we're also looking at culturally appropriate meeting those needs in serving those ends of accomplishing proper nutrition, for example. So this means actively engaging community members in designing locally owned and shared solutions. So the members of the community themselves own and share these solutions. And these connect to what the chapter call is environmental health politics, which is geared towards the goal of creating healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities, bringing them back to their roots in ways that are healthful for them, meaningful for them, and equitable for all members in that community. And that is the relationship of environmental justice with social determinants of health, which means the environment, the larger environment, housing, transportation, and health issues. So where is the communication goal here? The challenge, the communicative task here is to communicate needs and gaps in structural policies and initiatives, which means understanding and identifying where policy is failing a community. On structural levels. So, again, time to pause for a bit and think in terms of what's in the news that's currently related to environmental justice from this perspective. Browse your favorite news sites, whether they are political or social or cultural, and or even sports, and see where you can make these connections to environmental justice and communities. Where do you see a need? Where do you see a gap in current policy or communication? As we broaden out, let's look at the larger notion of ecosystem, planetary ecosystems, and individual health. Really, the broadest and the most individual are the most minutiae, and they're deeply linked with implications for both. Ecosystem health speaks to the link between ecosystems, human activity, and human health. So how human beings engage, intervene, and connect with the larger ecosystems and vice versa. So ecosystem integrity has been defined, in this case I've got the Jones citation, as the state or condition of an ecosystem that displays the biodiversity characteristic of its reference state, such as species composition and community structure, and is fully capable of sustaining normal ecosystem functioning. Quite a mouthful, but we're really looking at the integrity piece of it. So if you understand the notion of ecosystem, we're just connecting that with integrity, which means how is it true to its biodiversity in its sort of reference state, so its baseline state. And biodiversity might include things like species, composition, the mix in there, what kind of communities were a part of it, and how are these kind of moving together in a sustainable state in a balance. So that's where we are with ecosystem integrity, which means that an ecosystem has integrity when it is stable, in balance or equilibrium, and has the capacity to cope with human or anthropogenic interference. Anthropogenic, which means the sum total of how the human civilization is interacting with our ecosystem and vice versa, since it is a mutual interaction. So, in an earlier chapter, we had defined health as a balance or equilibrium from a whole person health communication perspective. We're extending and situating this sense of balance, within the planetary ecosystems of which we all are a part. Now, each of our health is really connected, as we have seen, in various ways, from food, from the kind of communication and justice facets, from the built environment, from the ecosystem environment, and multiple other ways. Our health is connected with this ecosystem health. And so we have what's known as ecological frameworks of health, which means human health is codependent upon ecological factors, just as much as ecological health is dependent on human health and human activity, in a complex relationship with other organisms comprising the ecosystem and the environment. We are all in some related. We cannot miss critical components of our environment, and if they deteriorate, it's going to impact our health. So attending to ecosystem health has closely associated with human health. Seeing our own health with respect to our food traditions, our community practices, and the various ways in which we sustain each other has particular benefits for our own well-being and health outcomes, and especially when we start thinking about those who are excluded or maybe in the minorities or communities that may have, marginalized voices in this conversation. They are often disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards and ecosystem degradation. So in this case, take a pause, hit pause on this on slide number 28. Explore the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, which is NIMHD. The website, it's linked under slide 28 under these slides, and look at its resources on ecosystems of health disparities and minority health. Go by any one state, maybe consider your state or a state you're familiar with or interested in. So choose any state, explore its health disparities data. What health outcomes are related to the physical environment? Think about that. And what health outcomes are related to the social, economic, and cultural environment? Think through that. So you can hit pause and maybe come back to this lecture after you've spent a moment or two doing that. And as we begin to close out of this section on ecosystem health and individual health and the larger conversation on the environment and health, there is a model that kind of brings this all together as the ecological model of health behavior and promotion. So ecological models of health behavior and promotion build on the premise that behavior is influenced by intrapersonal factors, which is things that are within us, biological, psychological, our attitudes, our genetic and cellular composition, as well as interpersonal factors, which are between us, so social, cultural factors, organizational factors, and then structural factors such as community, physical, environmental, and policy level factors simultaneously. So the ecological models of health behavior and promotion are really broad, and they look at who we are, our communities, interpersonal relationships, our organizational factors that we're a part of, and the physical and environmental and policy, governmental and structural factors. We all together are connected in this space of environment and health. And the goal of this sort of ecological model of health behavior and promotion is to help develop comprehensive intervention approaches, not piecemeal, and not, sort of individual components targeting these, but comprehensive approaches that systematically target mechanisms of change at each of these levels, so well thought through comprehensive interventions. What these models do, so an ecological model of health recognizes the importance of attending to social, environmental, and biological factors together when considering their influence on our health. We often tend to just focus on one component of these, and what this sort of a model does is invites us to take a look at how it all operates in the larger picture. And by doing so, we may get unique insights into our own health and the health of those who are maybe disadvantaged in one or the other facets. And do so through the lens of community engagement and empowerment. And except that now we're also thinking in terms of the physical and planetary environment. So we are really taking the most comprehensive view possible and from a whole person and social justice activism approach as we close out of this chapter. So many resources embedded here, and the links are provided under the chapter. Please take a moment, delve through. The engagement and application exercises will actually provide you even more opportunities to do so, and then the quiz and reading review, which I look forward to reading. So we've covered an enormous ground today, from environment, climate, weather as foundational terms to food insecurity, food systems, and food security. I would not want you to miss out on nutritional security and insecurity as well, as opposed to food. We've looked at environmental communication, environmental justice, and then finally ecosystem health and the ecological model that relates to that. So before you move on to the engagement and application advocacy application assignment and the reading review assignment, take another moment to think through what is one key takeaway from today's discussion on health and the environment for you? And how will you engage that takeaway in your own community? And as you wrap out, I hope you're kind of thinking through. I've left you with some questions about climate and weather. Why does it matter in thinking about how climate change is understood or communicated in the media or debated in the media and in policy discourses? And if you can name the 4 pillars of food security: availability, access, utilization, stability, also nutrition security, and give an example of a climate-related disruption to one of them. If you can define environmental justice, explain its connection to the social determinants of health and how it impacts us differentially. So for example, in things like housing and transportation, and how environmental justice plays into that specifically for different communities and results in different kinds of health inequities in those domains for those populations. Define ecosystem integrity in your own words, and see what are the 4 levels of influence in the ecological model of health behavior and promotion. Okay, thank you for staying with me through this chapter and engaging with all the links. Look forward to reading your materials.